Welcome to Web Handling. My name is Dave Roysum. In this week's War Stories series, I share a half dozen horror stories of customers believing the computers that control their winders. And that resulted in increased roll defects and other troubles. This can be so easily avoided by the builders including calibration instructions in their service manuals, and both builders and their customers doing field calibration upon installation and occasionally thereafter as needed. I know your time is precious, so let's get started. Recall that a war story is a memorable personal experience that we might learn from. We are guided by the saying that the smart person learns from their own mistakes, but the wise person learns from the mistakes of others. In this very short stories that follow, we learn that the first step in calibration is to measure friction, which then allows you to define the zero and finally the gain. We also learn, yet again, that you should not trust computers until they are checked and calibrated. Our first story is for a tissue winder that had suspected tight roll defects. Their response was to upgrade the nip control curve from an old-fashioned mechanical cam to a PLC-controlled curve. The output from the PLC was then sent to an I2P transmitter that pressurized the existing air cylinders. This winder curve is a plot of lay-on roller nip load versus roll diameter. The line underneath is what the computer thought was happening. The orange friction uncertainty band was what was actually happening to the nip load and the roll product. I show how to do this calibration in Web30130e through E, so we don't need to do that here. All we need to know here is the results of the calibration that only took a few minutes. The first is that both the error in zero and the uncertainty due to mechanical friction was of similar size as the entire range of the desired control curve. The combined effects were that the nip was 4 times greater than what it should have been. The results were that the mill had more tight defects after the upgrade than prior to it. Example 2 is similar in that we have another tissue rewinder that had tight defects and also had a large variability in the wound rolls. A calibration of the system showed that it had 32 psi of friction when something closer to 8 psi nip load would have been more appropriate. To make an analogy, this system didn't have a 4:1 signal-to-noise ratio. It had a 4:1 noise-to-signal ratio. Example 3 is for a winder that had no identifiable winder issues. Still, that didn't stop a winder salesman from selling an anti-friction slide upgrade from the old-fashioned greased V-gibs to modern linear ball bearing slides. The first result was an increase in friction exceeding several tons. The second was that the linear bearings wore out every 2 years when the life of gibs is essentially indefinite. Example 4 is a paper machine reel winder that had tight defects. Additionally, they had the nearly unheard of situation where the master rolls from the web maker were wound tighter than the shipping rolls on the rewinder that followed. I calibrated the system in a few minutes. It showed 24 psi of friction for a 3:1 noise-to-signal ratio. Here, and in the previous example, the winder nip control pressure is essentially a do-nothing knob because you could dial in zero pressure and still get an overly tight roll because the growing roll is trying to push the spool away in the presence of brutish friction and binding. Lest you think that troubles are confined to old machines, I share this in the following story. Both are with brand new state-of-the-art winders built by the best names in the business. Example 5 is from a winder that had what is almost certainly the most advanced controls and data acquisition in the winding world. Still, they had tight defects. To make a long story short, the builder had a 2x error in the computer code, so the nip was twice as high as the industry norm. So even though this winder had minimal mechanical binding, it was still capable of wrecking rolls due to a computer, or rather a computer coder, that couldn't do the math correctly and because no one checked the work. This final example is also from a brand new state-of-the-art pilot winder built by one of the best names in the business. It also had minimal mechanical friction. But that did not stop the computer from screwing up big time, even more than the previous example. When I started the machine up by dialing in a 5 PLI for a nip roll, the nip actually opened up. Here, we are not talking about a 20% or even a 2x error. The computer did not even get the sign of the value correct. These 6 examples are illustrative of dozens of other winding machines that I personally checked by calibration. How we got there is by 2 easily avoidable errors. The first is that the machine builder not only didn't provide calibration instructions, they obviously didn't do the calibrations themselves either. This is especially challenging when you have what people often call black box controls, where the customer is not even allowed to see what goes on under the hood. So, if you buy a new machine, a service manual with calibration instructions should be called out on the purchase order. If you have an existing machine, you might want to check the calibration yourself by measuring friction, then defining zero, and finally checking gain as we described in Web30130e through C. This certainly should be done on startup or whenever you encounter a new rash of tight or loose winding defects. I hope you've enjoyed these nip control horror stories. Stay tuned for next week's show, where we will describe how one of the most common web tests failed to do its job at one of the largest of the web companies. The error was not discovered for more than a decade, ruining much of the quality control data taken during that time in its several labs. If you have a topic you would like to hear about, let me know in the comment section below. If you found any of these stories to be interesting or useful here, please like and share and subscribe. See you next time.